They called him insane for digging into a frozen cliff, until the day his hidden cave became the only warm place left alive. High on Redcrest Ridge, a lone veteran and his loyal dog carved a home into solid stone while the whole town laughed at them. But when a brutal winter struck and every cabin nearly froze, the truth about that mysterious cave began to change everything. Before we begin, comment below. Where are you watching from today? The wind crawled across Redcrest Ridge like a living thing, dragging cold air down the cliffs and through the tall pines that clung to the mountainside. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of his inherited land, boots planted in the thin crust of early winter snow. Ranger pressed against his leg like a silent shadow. The land stretched wide and empty around them. Montana sky above, wild country below, and nothing in between except the weight Ethan carried inside himself. He hadn't planned on coming back here. Not after the funeral. Not after the nights when sleep broke into pieces and the past came roaring back like a storm with teeth. But the letter from the county office had arrived anyway, telling him his uncle's old plot, a jagged slice of cliff and pine, was now in his name. Most people in Cedar Hollow said the land was worthless, too steep to build on, too exposed to survive on, too far from town for any normal man to want it. Ethan wasn't normal anymore, and he knew it. Ranger's ears twitched, picking up sounds Ethan barely noticed. A raven somewhere above, the shuffle of a deer far off,
the creak of pine branches straining against the cold. The German shepherd didn't make a sound, but Ethan felt the dog's focus shift. That sharp awareness only a trained canine carried even in peace. Ranger had saved Ethan's life more times than Ethan could count, on sand, in mountains, in places where heat shimmered off metal and the world exploded without warning. Now Ranger followed him as if he still expected danger around every corner. Maybe he wasn't wrong. Ethan knelt and placed a hand on Ranger's back. The dog leaned into him, steady, warm, grounding. "We're really doing this," Ethan murmured. His voice came out rough, like he hadn't used it much. Because he hadn't.
A light breeze lifted the longer strands of Ranger's coat, carrying the clean scent of pine to cover the memories that still clawed at Ethan sometimes. Buried under that quiet mountain wind, the echoes of his wife's voice came back, soft, distant, like memory had to push through fog just to reach him. He shut his eyes and breathed slowly. Ranger nudged his shoulder, a reminder to stay here in the present, not drift back into what hurt too much. Ethan rose and scanned the land again. His uncle's old cabin was nothing more than a collapsed frame now, bare posts leaning like tired bones, roof long gone. But the ridge wall itself, that was solid, strong, cold as sin in winter, but strong. And beneath its harsh surface lay something steadier than any wood-built home could give him.
A place he could shape. A place where noise couldn't find him so easily. A place where the world couldn't break open without warning. The distant crunch of tires on gravel made him stiffen. Ranger tensed too, head turning sharply. A truck crept up the narrow mountain road, kicking up dust even in the snow. Walt Rogers leaned out the window, weathered face set in something between disbelief and pity. "Cole," Walt called, voice carrying across the open land. "You can't seriously be setting up out here. Folks in town think you're making a mistake." Ethan didn't answer right away. He had learned long ago that silence often said more than words. Ranger let out a low breath, not a growl, just acknowledgement of another presence. Walt climbed out and shut his door with a heavy thud.
"This place ain't fit for living. No shelter, no insulation. Winter'll eat you alive. You and that dog." He nodded toward Ranger, who stared back, unblinking. Ethan finally spoke. "We'll manage." Walt looked at the ridge wall behind Ethan and shook his head. "Heard folks say you're digging into that cliff. Digging. Like a man looking for his own grave." Ethan met his eyes, calm, steady. "Stone keeps heat better than lumber. Rock doesn't burn, doesn't rot, doesn't creak at night when the wind feels like a war cry." His voice softened on the last words. Ranger pressed closer. Walt's expression shifted, discomfort flickering there. Everyone in town knew Ethan had been through things no man should have to see. "Look," Walt said, lowering his voice. "I ain't here to judge.
Just don't want to see you freeze out here alone." "I'm not alone," Ethan replied, laying a hand on Ranger's neck. Walt sighed and stepped back. "Well, suit yourself. But if this place swallows you whole, don't say nobody warned you." The truck growled back to life and rumbled down the road, leaving Ethan and Ranger alone again in the cold silence. Ethan stood there long after the engine noise faded, staring at the mountain wall. Ranger bumped his leg, then looked toward the ridge as if urging him forward. Ethan nodded. He wasn't sure if he believed in signs anymore, but if the world still whispered anything worth hearing, maybe Ranger was the closest thing to a voice he trusted. "All right, boy," he said quietly.
Let's get to work." They walked toward the cliffside together, two silhouettes against the pale Montana sky, one man carrying a heart full of fractures and one dog who refused to leave him behind. A new beginning waited inside the stone. Ethan Cole paused at the base of the ridge, the cold air slipping beneath his collar as Ranger trotted ahead, nose low to the ground. The morning sun touched only the upper ledges of Redcrest Ridge, leaving the lower slope swallowed in blue shade. The cliff towered over them, raw, jagged, ancient. Most folks in Cedar Hollow said it was a wall meant to keep people out. Ethan saw something different, a place that could hold heat, a place that didn't creak in a storm, a place that might let him breathe.
He set down his pack, pulled out a heavy pickaxe, and gripped the handle until his gloves cracked. Ranger settled nearby, tail curled around his paws, watching every movement like a sentinel on duty. "All right, buddy," Ethan murmured. "Let's carve out a home." The first strike rang through the valley like a gunshot, sharp, metallic, echoing long after Ethan lowered the tool. His breath hung white in the air, rising and fading as he swung again and again, each impact sending a jolt through his arms. Small chips of rock scattered across the ground, tiny beginnings of something much larger. By noon, Ethan had opened a shallow scar in the ridge wall. Nothing impressive to anyone else, but to Ethan, it was the first page of a new life.
Ranger circled behind him, sometimes nudging a loose stone with his nose, sometimes barking softly when Ethan stepped too close to an unstable patch of shale. "Yeah, I know," Ethan said with a weary smile. "Watch my footing, same old rules." But their rhythm didn't go unnoticed. A distant engine groaned along the mountain road. Ethan straightened, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cold. Ranger's ears perked, his body stiffening but not hostile, just ready. A blue pickup truck rolled into view, rattling with every bump. The paint looked older than Ethan's military jacket. It was Lewis Parsons, owner of the general store and unofficial town gossip. The truck slowed, then stopped a few yards away. Lewis climbed out, boots crunching the thin frost.
He was a stout man, red-faced from decades of mountain winters, and he squinted at the shadow forming in the ridge wall. "So it's true," he said loudly. "You really are digging into that rock like a badger." Ethan leaned on the pickaxe, saying nothing. Ranger positioned himself between them, not aggressive, just watchful. Lewis shook his head, chuckling in disbelief. Heard from Martha down at the diner that you're making yourself a tomb. Town's been talking. That Cole fella's lost his marbles, they say. Digging into a cliff like he ain't got sense left. Ethan felt the words hit him, but he didn't flinch. He had heard much worse in the service, spoken by men who didn't know what to do with silence or pain. I'm building shelter, he said calmly. In a cliff? Lewis barked a laugh.
Cole, that rock's colder than a widow's handshake. You'll freeze before Christmas. Ethan pointed toward the ridge where Ranger stood sniffing the cracks in the stone. Rock stores heat. Once I get deep enough, temperature holds steady. Doesn't matter if it's 20 below outside. Lewis blinked, thrown off. Where'd you learn that? Ethan hesitated. Images flashed across his mind. Sandstorms, smoke, the sound of rotors thumping overhead. Ranger pulling him from collapsing rubble. Nights spent underground because the surface was on fire. Life taught me, Ethan finally said. Lewis stared, unsure how to respond. Ranger stepped forward, giving a low rumble in his throat. Not a threat, just a reminder that the conversation had gone on long enough. Lewis cleared his throat. Well, you're free to do what you want, I reckon. Folks'll still talk, though. They always do, Ethan replied. Lewis climbed back into his truck. Before the engine started, he called out, Just don't let that hole swallow you, Cole. This town's got enough ghosts. The truck rattled away, leaving Ethan and Ranger alone again in the cold, humming silence. Ethan stared at the half-formed opening in the stone. Maybe the town thought he was digging his own grave. Maybe they thought he was trying to disappear. But they didn't understand that this quiet piece of rock was the first thing in years that made sense to him. He raised the pickaxe and swung. The clang of metal striking stone echoed across the ridge. Another swing, another crack splitting through the air.
His breath wheezed out in misted bursts, but he didn't stop. Work gave his mind something to hold besides memories. Ranger barked once, sharp, alert. Ethan turned just in time to see a horse approaching from the lower trail. Walt Rogers sat in the saddle, coat flapping behind him. Walt pulled up beside Ethan, brow furrowed deeper than the lines on his weathered face. Lewis says you're dead set on this, Walt said without dismounting. Man can't live in rock. Rock's steadier than anything I've had in a long time, Ethan replied. Walt looked at the half-dug entrance, then at Ranger, who stood silently like stone carved from muscle and loyalty. You and that dog survived things none of us can understand, Walt said. But surviving ain't the same as living. Ethan met his eyes. This is how I live. Walt exhaled, shaking his head. Just don't let your past drive you into the mountain. Cold gets mean out here. Ethan didn't answer. Walt tugged his reins, turning his horse away. Town's watching you, Cole. They think you're breaking apart. The horse trotted off toward Cedar Hollow, and Ethan stood there long after Walt vanished behind the trees. Ranger pressed his nose into Ethan's hand, grounding him once again. Let them watch, Ethan whispered. He lifted the pickaxe one more time, and the sound of metal striking stone echoed like a stubborn heartbeat against the cold Montana sky. The cave, his cave, was beginning to take shape. But as the ringing faded into the wind, something else rose in its place. A distant thud. Low, hollow, too familiar. Ethan froze.
His fingers tightened around the pickaxe handle. Ranger caught it too. Ears twitching, body lowering, eyes sharp. The sound wasn't real. It wasn't here. But it lived inside him. The ridge dissolved from his view, fading into the swirling dust of another world, dry heat, sand devils churning, the metallic taste of adrenaline sitting thick on his tongue. He blinked, but the Montana sky flickered, replaced by a ceiling of collapsing concrete. Ranger lunged forward in his memory, barking, dragging Ethan by the vest as a shockwave tore through the air. His breath quickened. His grip slipped. Not again. The past came roaring back so hard he staggered. Ranger pressed into him, nudging his ribs, snapping him out of the moment just enough to keep him standing.
Ethan dropped to a knee, digging his fingers into Ranger's fur like it was the only solid thing in the world. "Easy. I'm here," he whispered, though his voice trembled. The cold wind helped. The pine-scented air cut through the smoke of memory, pulling him back inch by inch until Redcrest Ridge slowly returned to shape around him. He exhaled shakily. He hated these episodes. He hated how they hijacked him, stole whole minutes without warning. But Ranger, his lifeline, never left his side when they hit. Ethan rose, brushing the dust from his jeans. Ranger stayed close enough that their shoulders touched. "I'm okay," Ethan muttered, though he wasn't sure if he said it for himself or the dog. He swung the pickaxe again, forcing his mind into the rhythm. Metal, stone, breath, repeat.
Every strike was a reminder he was still here, still moving, still alive. As he worked deeper, the opening widened enough to step inside. Shadows swallowed him, the temperature noticeably rising from the trapped heat of the earth. Ranger slipped in behind him, nose twitching as he explored the forming chamber. Ethan swept his flashlight across the stone and imagined walls smoothed by clay, a roof shaped to bear weight, a place where the wind couldn't touch him. A home grown straight from the rock. He ran his palm along the wall, feeling the natural warmth lingering beneath the cold surface. He knew the science. He'd lived it before. Deep underground, temperature stayed steady, unbothered by seasons or storms.
He'd learned that in the army, stationed with mountain units who taught him how to stay alive when the world tried to kill you. But the memory that mattered most wasn't the lesson. It was Ranger. A rock tremor in the mountains overseas had trapped their patrol squad inside a collapsed outpost. Dust filled the air, thick as fog. A beam crashed down, pinning Ethan's leg. Panic clawed at him. The darkness pressed heavy. But Ranger, half buried himself, had crawled through debris and hooked his teeth into Ethan's vest strap, pulling, tugging, refusing to let go even when another shock rattled the tunnel. Ranger had saved him. Ranger always saved him. Back in the present, Ethan's chest tightened, not with fear this time, but with gratitude so sharp it hurt.
"You and me," he murmured, scratching Ranger's neck. "We keep each other going." Ranger nudged him once, firmly, like an answer. Outside, clouds drifted in, shading the ridge. A sudden wind blasted through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of laughter, voices from the trail below. Ethan stepped out of the half-dug chamber and followed the sound. 3 townsfolk on horseback rode the lower path, glancing up at him. One of them, Mark Turner, known for talking more than thinking, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Hey, Cole, you building a fox den up there?" Another man snorted. "More like digging his own shelter for the afterlife." A woman laughed. "Someone better check on him before he vanishes into that rock." Their laughter rolled through the valley, sharp and careless. Ethan didn't respond. He stood still, jaw tight, Ranger bristling but not growling, trained discipline holding strong. The riders moved on, but the sting lingered long after they disappeared behind a hill. He had grown used to being misunderstood. People couldn't see PTSD. They didn't see the nights he woke gasping, heart racing, or the days where silence felt safer than words. They saw a man alone with a dog, digging into a cliff like he'd lost his grip on reality. but they didn't know what it meant to hold on to survival with trembling hands. Ethan tapped the pickaxe against a stone, the metallic echo grounding him. "Let them think what they want, Ranger." Ranger leaned against him, warm and steady. The wind picked up again, colder now, hinting that winter would arrive sooner than anyone expected. Ethan studied the forming cave, envisioning what it could be, what it needed to be, before the first storm hit. A safe place, a warm place, a place where the past couldn't touch him quite so easily. "We need to work faster," he murmured. Ranger barked once, sharp and certain, like he agreed. Ethan lifted the pickaxe again, determination burning beneath the weariness in his eyes. If the town thought he was crazy, so be it. If the ridge whispered old ghosts at night, he'd face them. If the world believed he wouldn't survive winter, he'd prove them wrong. He swung the pickaxe with renewed force, stone shattering under each strike. He wasn't digging a grave.
He was digging a way back to life. Over the next several days, Ethan and Ranger fell into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. At sunrise, mist curled along the ridge like a slow-moving river, and Ethan stepped into the growing hollow, his breath forming pale clouds in the cold air. Ranger always entered first, nose low, checking every inch of the stone chamber before Ethan lifted a single tool. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong, and Ethan trusted those instincts more than he trusted most people. The cave had widened enough that Ethan could walk several steps into the darkness without ducking. A soft, steady warmth pulsed faintly from deep inside the rock. Subtle, almost like the slow breathing of the mountain itself.
The moment Ethan felt that shift in temperature, something inside him settled. It confirmed what he already knew from years spent in harsh terrain. Earth didn't lie. Not when it came to heat. Not when it came to shelter. He ran his hands along the rough interior. "This room needs to be shaped like a dome," he murmured, thinking aloud. "Spread the weight, distribute stress." Ranger answered with a low bark, as if approving the plan. Ethan sketched lines on the stone with charcoal from an old fire pit, tracing where the ceiling would curve and where the walls would be shaved smooth. He used measurements he remembered from specialized trainings, lessons etched into his mind long before he ever imagined needing them for anything other than survival missions.
2 ventilation shafts, he continued. Cold air sinks, warm air rises. He tapped 2 spots on the wall. Intake down low, exit up high. Ranger tilted his head as if listening. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, curling through the pines like a warning. Winter was coming fast. Ethan tightened his grip on the charcoal. There wasn't time to hesitate, not when storms on this ridge could turn deadly overnight. He set the charcoal aside, grabbed his shovel, and began cutting the angled trench for the cold air intake. Ranger stayed close, pacing the edge of the ridge with watchful eyes. Hours passed, the sound of metal against earth echoing across the valley like a slow heartbeat. Ethan's breath fogged and his muscles trembled, but something deeper than exhaustion kept him moving.
He worked until the sun dipped behind Redcrest Ridge, throwing long shadows across the land. Ranger barked once, sharp, urgent. Ethan looked up. A figure approached from the lower trail. For a split second, his heart tightened, expecting mockery again. But it wasn't one of the ranch men or the riders who had laughed earlier. It was Maya Watts, the town's quiet nurse. She carried a small canvas bag in one hand and pulled her scarf closer with the other, cheeks flushed from the climb. "Evening, Ethan," she called gently. Ethan straightened, suddenly aware of the dirt streaked across his coat, the sweat chilling on his neck. Ranger trotted to greet her, tail low but friendly. Maya knelt to scratch behind the dog's ears. "He remembers me," she smiled.
He remembers everyone, Ethan said softly. Just decides who he trusts. Maya rose, her eyes drifting to the growing cave. So the rumors are true? Ethan stiffened. Depends what people are saying. She shrugged. Depends which people you listen to. Some say you've lost your mind. Others say you're just different. Different doesn't bother me. It shouldn't. Maya stepped closer, studying the ridge wall with surprising understanding. You're building into the mountain, using the earth as insulation. Ethan blinked. You know about that? My grandfather built storm shelters in Wyoming. The deep ones stayed warm without wood burning. People thought he was strange, too. She turned to face him. But his shelters saved half the county during the blizzard of '82. Her words hung in the cold air, steady and calm, like someone finally speaking his language. Ethan exhaled slowly. Rock stores heat. Clay holds it. At 20 feet, temperature doesn't care what winter looks like outside. Maya nodded. Smart? No judgment, no laughter. Just acknowledgement. The simple respect in her tone struck Ethan harder than the insults had. For months, he'd lived surrounded by people who whispered behind his back. Now someone stood in front of him, seeing the intention, not the madness. She glanced at his trembling hands. You're working too hard. Your muscles are locking up. I'm fine. You're stubborn, she corrected gently. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small jar. Wintergreen liniment. Use it before bed or you'll barely lift your arms tomorrow. He hesitated. Kindness still caught him off guard, but he accepted the jar with a small nod. Ranger nudged his legs softly, as if encouraging him to take it. Maya glanced toward the cave again. This place is going to be something, isn't it? It has to be, Ethan replied. A gust of wind swept between them, stirring dust and pine needles. Maya shivered and stepped back toward the trail. Storm season's coming early. You be careful up here. Ethan watched her descend the slope, scarf fluttering behind her. When she disappeared between the trees, silence returned, except for the low, rhythmic hum of the ridge breathing warmth through stone. He entered the cave once more, Ranger padding beside him. In the faint glow of his lantern, the chamber looked less like a hollow and more like a blueprint for a future he had barely allowed himself to imagine. A home shaped by survival. A shelter built from the earth itself. A place where ghosts couldn't follow quite so easily. Ranger brushed against his leg, and Ethan rested a hand on the dog's head. This is just the beginning, he whispered. And for the first time since returning to Montana, he believed it. But belief didn't stop the winter. Within a week, the sky over Cedar Hollow darkened into a hard gray lid. Clouds crawled low across the mountains like animals searching for somewhere to strike. The wind sharpened until it sliced through layers of clothing, and every pine tree on Redcrest Ridge moaned beneath the pressure. Ethan felt the shift in the air before the first storm hit. Years of field training had shaped his instincts. He could smell cold coming the way some men smelled rain. As he stepped out of the cave at sunrise, the wind carried a warning, the kind that tightened the back of his neck. Storm season's early, he muttered. Ranger barked once, as if agreeing. The ground was already hard as iron, frost climbing out of the soil like thin white claws. Ethan strapped on his gloves and got back to work, chipping away at the cave ceiling to form the curved dome that would hold winter at bay. Ranger patrolled outside, nose in the wind, tail moving slowly like a pendulum measuring danger. By midday, a thin curtain of snow drifted down from the sky. It wasn't much, just a whisper of what was coming. But far below on the valley floor, Ethan spotted movement among the ranch houses. Smoke billowed from chimneys. People rushed to stack wood under tarp covers. Walt Rogers' boys dragged dead branches toward a growing firewood pile. Everyone was preparing. Everyone except him. He had no woodpile, no iron stove. Just stone, depth, earth, and the knowledge that warmth lived underground if he could reach it in time. He worked faster. Snow thickened around him, swirling in tight circles whenever the wind caught a loose patch of powder on the ridge. The cold crept under his collar, burning his ears and fingertips despite the gloves. Ranger's fur gathered flakes until he looked dusted and white. "Just a few more hours," Ethan said under his breath, though his arm muscles screamed from swinging tools since dawn. By late afternoon, the storm arrived with teeth. A roaring gust hit the ridge wall so hard it sent Ethan stumbling against the stone. Ranger growled, barking at the wind as if it were a wild creature charging straight at them. Snow didn't fall anymore. It attacked sideways in sheets that stung Ethan's face. He retreated into the cave, Ranger scrambling in beside him. Even half-finished, the chamber felt calmer. The wind screamed outside, but inside, the stone softened the noise until it became a distant hum. But the warmth was still weak. Too shallow, too unfinished.
Ethan pressed his palms to the stone wall, feeling only the faintest hint of heat coming from deep below. He needed more depth, another 6, maybe 8 feet, before the temperature reached that steady mid-50s range. He inhaled, tasting cold metal and dust. "We're not ready yet." Ranger lay at his feet, but didn't rest. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan, ears tilting back every time the wind howled like something alive. Suddenly, through the storm's roar, the distant cry of cattle carried across the ridge. It was desperate, broken, animals in danger. Ethan stepped out of the cave opening, squinting into the storm. Across the valley, Walt Rogers' herd scattered in panic, silhouettes barely visible through the flurry. Snow piled fast around their legs. Calves stumbled.
Men shouted orders the wind shredded before they reached Ethan's ears. Winter wasn't just early, it was vicious. Ethan pulled his coat tighter. Ranger nudged his hip anxiously. "We can't help them now," Ethan whispered. "Not in this weather." They watched as Walt and his ranch hands pushed the herd toward whatever shelter they could find. The storm swallowed them piece by piece, and Ethan felt a heavy ache settle in his chest. He knew that ache. He knew what it meant to watch something suffer and not be able to stop it. Ranger whined softly, sensing the shift in Ethan's breathing. Ethan knelt, pressing his forehead gently to the dog's. "We'll get through this," he murmured. "Just like before." By evening, the ridge was buried in white. Snow piled knee-deep around the cave entrance. Ethan built a temporary barrier of stones and branches to block the wind while he worked inside. The cave glowed faintly from his lantern, shadows climbing the walls like ghosts of unfinished plans. He resumed shaping the ventilation shafts, one low, one high, working by lamplight as Ranger lay near him, eyes following each movement. The storm's rage outside seemed distant, muffled by the thickening walls. And the deeper he carved, the more the air changed. Not warm yet, but stable, heavy, still. Hours passed. His hands throbbed. His breath came in steady, disciplined rhythms, learned long ago to control panic. When he finally stepped outside, the storm was easing. The wind softened to a hiss. Snowflakes drifted lazily instead of sideways. Ranger pushed through the snow beside him like a small plow, then stopped suddenly, ears shooting up. "What is it?" Ethan whispered. Down the slope, faint lights flickered through the trees, lanterns moving in nervous patterns. Voices reached him, carried by the dying wind. "Lost 2 calves already. Cold's killing everything. Caleb's coughing again. Ethan's stomach tightened. Caleb, the youngest Rogers boy, 6 years old, a quiet kid with large eyes who always hid behind his mother's coat when new people visited the farm. Ethan watched the lanterns until they vanished. Ranger pressed against him, seeking warmth and giving it back in equal measure. The cold deepened around them, but Ethan's resolve hardened.
He looked back at the cave, the rough edges, the unfinished doorway, the promise buried inside the stone. "We're running out of time," he whispered. Ranger barked once, firm, ready. Winter had arrived in Cedar Hollow, and it wasn't leaving without taking something from everyone who lived there. By the second week of storms, Redcrest Ridge no longer looked like the world Ethan had stepped into. The mountains had transformed into pale, silent giants. Snow clung to every slope, weighting down branches until some snapped in the night with loud cracks that sounded too much like explosions. The sky stayed a dim pewter color, never fully brightening, never softening. Inside the half-finished cave, Ethan worked by lamplight, shaping the curved ceiling, smoothing the walls with a clay mixture that burned his fingers even through gloves. Ranger lay near the entrance, head resting on his paws, but eyes never fully closed. The dog listened to everything: the wind, the shifting snow, Ethan's breathing. By late evening, Ethan's hands had cramped, and his back ached in a way that reminded him he wasn't the 20-year-old soldier who used to run mountains with 60 pounds of gear. He sat down on a makeshift bench of stacked stones, letting the numbness settle. Ranger came over and rested his chin on Ethan's knee. "I know, boy," Ethan murmured. "I should sleep." But sleep wasn't simple. Not for him. Not in winter. Not when the dark pressed close. He lay on his cot anyway, Ranger curling beside him for warmth. The lantern flickered against the clay walls, casting shadows that danced like figures caught in silent argument. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed slow. The cave air was cool, steady, more comforting than any cabin. Yet as his breathing slowed, something deep inside him loosened at the wrong angle. The wind outside howled through the trees, bending low in a pitched wail. It sounded like a siren. Ethan's eyes shot open, except they didn't see the cave. They saw sand, smoke, concrete dust swirling under a ruined ceiling, Ranger barking wildly, pulling at Ethan's vest as the ground trembled. A second shock rattled overhead. A radio screamed somewhere nearby. Men shouted names that never came back.
Ethan gasped, gripping the sleeping bag until his knuckles turned white. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs so hard it felt like the mountain itself was shaking. "Ranger!" he choked, unable to fully pull himself from the memory. Ranger bolted upright, barking sharply, the sound echoing off the stone. He pushed himself against Ethan, forcing his body weight across Ethan's chest to steady him. Ethan's breath came in shallow bursts, each one faster than the last. The wind outside rose again, another long, violent howl, and it sent Ethan spiraling deeper. In his mind, it wasn't wind at all. It was a helicopter rotoring in low. It was a warning siren. It was a wall collapsing. "Not again," Ethan gasped. "Not here." Ranger barked in Ethan's face, loud and demanding.
The sensation snapped some part of the nightmare. Ethan focused on Ranger, on his eyes, steady and dark and real. Ranger pressed closer, pinning Ethan's shoulders to keep him from thrashing, grounding him in a way that no medic, no counselor had ever managed. Ethan's breath broke, stuttered, then slowed. Tears he didn't feel coming slid down his temples into his hairline. Ranger licked his cheek once, as if to say, "Stay with me. Right here." Minutes passed before Ethan's breathing evened out. The tremors in his hands faded. The cave came back into focus. The clay walls, the lantern glow, the cold breath of wind sneaking through the unfinished doorway. He raised a shaking hand to Ranger's fur, gripping it tightly. "You pulled me back," he whispered hoarsely.
Like always. Ranger lowered his head and nestled it against Ethan's chest, listening to the slowing heartbeat. After a long stretch of silence, Ethan sat up, wiping his face with the back of his sleeve. "I'm okay," he murmured, though his voice wavered. "I'm okay." Ranger didn't move away. He never did until he was certain Ethan was steady again. Ethan drew a long breath and rubbed his temples. "I'm sorry you have to see that," he whispered, "but I'm glad you're here." He looked around the dim cave, at the half-finished walls, at the bare clay floor. Somehow, this raw, unfinished space felt more like home than any place he'd lived since returning to the States. But that also meant something else. He had to finish it. He had to finish it soon. The storm outside continued to roar. Snow blew through the temporary barrier at the cave entrance, scattering across the floor in tiny flurries. Ranger growled softly at the wind, then lay protectively across Ethan's boots. Ethan leaned back against the curved wall. The clay held a faint warmth, just enough to remind him why he'd chosen this path, to build something steady, something sheltered, something the storms couldn't reach, something the past couldn't destroy. A sudden gush of wind struck the ridge, hard enough to send snow trickling from the upper ledges. Ethan flinched. Ranger sprang to his feet, barking sharply toward the entrance. Ethan stood and stepped outside. The storm had broken open in full force. Snow blew sideways in thick white sheets, and the valley below was swallowed in swirling gray. He heard distant shouts, maybe ranch hands trying to save their livestock, though the wind shredded every word before it reached him. Lights flickered in the far distance, ranch houses. And near Walt Rogers' home, a figure moved hurriedly between buildings, stumbling under the weight of something nearly invisible through the snow. Ranger whined anxiously. "I see it," Ethan whispered. "They're struggling." For a moment, he considered running to help. But the storm was too hard, the snow too deep. He wasn't ready, not tonight, not yet. He backed into the cave, sealing what little warmth remained. Ranger came to him, pushing close. Ethan's breath left his body in a long, quiet exhale. "Tonight was close," he murmured. "Too close." Ranger rested his head against Ethan's knee. Outside, winter tore at the ridge with relentless force. But inside that unfinished cave, under the flickering lantern light, a man and his dog sat together, waiting, breathing, surviving. Not broken, not alone, just fighting another night the only way they knew how. In the middle of the storm, the bond between them grew stronger than stone. The next morning broke in a pale, muffled silence. The storm had passed, leaving Cedar Hollow buried under a thick, untouched blanket of snow. Branches sagged low, fences vanished beneath white drifts, and the sky above carried that still, icy blue that only appears after nature has emptied itself. Ethan pushed aside the temporary barrier and stepped out of the cave into a world that looked carved from frost. Ranger followed close, shaking snow from his coat in a wide arc. Their breath rose in soft plumes, curling upward into the cold morning air. The ridge shimmered under the sun, but the stillness felt deceptive, like the land was holding its breath before the next blow. Ethan checked the trail leading down to town. No footprints, no movement, just silence. "Let's see what we're up against today," he murmured to Ranger. Inside the cave, the air carried a faint warmth that hadn't been there the week before. It wasn't perfect, not the deep earth temperatures he was aiming for, but it was stable, predictable. the difference between life and danger. Ethan pressed a hand to the clay-coated wall. The stone had begun to radiate stored heat back into the room, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of the mountain. He moved to the ventilation shafts, checking the airflow with a small tuft of sage smoke. The smoke dipped through the lower shaft, hovered at the cave floor, then drifted upward toward the higher vent before disappearing into the open sky. Airflow was working. Heat retention was working. Everything he'd learned, everything that had kept him and Ranger alive overseas, was working here too. Ranger walked a slow circle, sniffing the walls as if performing his own inspection. The dog's posture was more relaxed today, his tail gently swaying, his ears loose. He felt it too, the safety building inside these walls. Ethan exhaled deeply, tension leaving his shoulders for the first time since the storms began. "Feels almost like a home, huh?" he asked. Ranger thumped his tail against the clay floor, but the peace didn't last long. Voices echoed faintly from the valley below, sharp, urgent shouts carried by the cold. Ethan stepped outside again and scanned the distance. He saw 3 men digging at a snowdrift the size of a cattle trailer. A fallen tree lay across the Rogers property fence line, its weight crushing the boards beneath. Closer to the barn, Walt Rogers swung an axe, splitting frozen wood with a force that looked more like desperation than labor. Ethan imagined the inside of those cabins. Stoves burning around the clock, windows fogged over, children bundled in coats indoors just to stay warm. He remembered Maya mentioning the Rogers boys' cough days earlier. Winter always hit the youngest and oldest the hardest. The contrast stung. His cave, half finished, was warmer than most homes in town. But nobody knew. Not yet. Ranger barked suddenly, startling Ethan from his thoughts. The dog stood at the cave's entrance, posture rigid, ears aimed downhill. Ethan followed his gaze. A group of townspeople trudged up the lower trail. 3 men, 2 women, and even a teenage girl wrapped in a wool shawl. Snow clung to their boots as they climbed, breath misting out in quick bursts. As they drew closer, recognition settled in.
Mark Turner, the man who had mocked Ethan just days before, led the group. Ethan's jaw tightened. Ranger moved forward protectively, planting himself halfway between Ethan and the incoming crowd. "Cole," Mark called, raising a hand. "We want to talk." The group reached the ridge, stamping snow from their coats. Their cheeks were red, their expressions strained and worn. For once there was no laughter, no smug looks, just cold and worry. Ethan crossed his arms. "What do you need?" Mark pointed at the cave. "Is it true that things stays warm in winter?" A murmur of anxious hope rippled through the group. Ethan glanced at Ranger, then back at them. "It's not finished yet." "But it's warmer than our cabins?" asked Mrs. Hanley, hugging herself tightly.
"My grandkids slept in their coats last night. The stove can't heat the back rooms anymore." Mr. Parsons stepped forward, shivering. "We've burned through a month's wood in 1 week. We can't keep this up." Ethan stiffened. "Look, I didn't build this place for—" "We're not asking for a place to stay," Parsons cut in. "Just want to know if the rumors are true." Ethan sighed and motioned for them to come inside. Ranger stayed alert but moved aside. One by one, they stepped into the cave, and each face changed the moment they crossed the threshold. The shock was clear. Eyes widening, shoulders dropping, mouths parting slightly. The air inside was noticeably different from the sharp cold outside. Not warm like summer, but stable, bearable, comforting. A quiet, natural heat radiated off the clay walls, wrapping around them like a wool blanket. Mrs. Hanley placed a hand over her mouth. "My lord, it's warmer than my kitchen." Parsons touched the wall, pressing his palm firmly against it. "Feels like a living thing." Mark Turner turned in a slow circle. "This is impossible." Ethan stepped farther inside, Ranger beside him. "It's not impossible. It's geothermal stability. The Earth holds heat. Once you dig deep enough, temperature hardly changes all year." The group stared at him as if hearing stone speak. Ethan continued, "This place is only halfway finished. When it's done, it'll hold around 60 degrees without burning a single log." Mark blinked.
You're telling me this mountain's got enough heat in it to beat a Montana winter? Ethan nodded. If you build it right. Silence settled. Hope, small, fragile, unsure, began to glow in their eyes. Ethan looked around at them, sensing something shifting in the room. A few days ago, these same people laughed at him. Now they stood inside his unfinished cave as if they'd stepped into a miracle. Mrs. Hanley inhaled slowly. If this can keep you and that dog warm, maybe it could help the rest of us too. Ethan didn't answer right away. He just stood there, feeling the warmth radiating through the clay, feeling Ranger lean lightly against his leg, steady, certain, loyal. He realized in that moment that everything was changing. The cave wasn't just a shelter anymore.
It was a quiet revelation, a defiant answer to the storm. And Cedar Hollow had finally taken notice. But storms don't care about hope, and winter always finds the weakest first. 2 days after the townsfolk visited Ethan's cave, the cold deepened in a way that didn't feel natural anymore. It sank into the valley like a living weight, pressing on cabins, slipping through floorboards, turning breath into ice. The sky stayed a dull white, as if the sun had forgotten how to shine. Ethan stood at the ridge's edge with Ranger at his side, watching the Rogers Ranch below. Thin smoke curled from their chimney, too weak for a family fighting that kind of cold. Even from a distance, Ethan sensed something wasn't right. Ranger felt it too. The dog whined softly, nose lifted toward the ranch, body tense. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I feel it." By late morning, the wind pushed hard across the ridge. Snow blew in swirling currents, scraping along the ground like sand. Ethan retreated into the cave again, reinforcing a section of the wall where clay had cracked overnight. Ranger paced restlessly, unable to settle. Then, through the drifting snow, a figure appeared on the trail below. Someone running. Not walking. Running. Ranger barked sharply, and Ethan turned. It was Maya. She stumbled up the path, coat flapping wildly, breath coming out in frantic clouds. The moment she reached the cave entrance, she doubled over, hands on her knees, trying to catch her breath. Ethan moved toward her, heart tightening. "Maya, what happened?" She looked up, eyes wide with fear. "It's Caleb." Ethan felt his stomach drop. "Walt's boy?" Maya nodded, pulling her scarf down. "He's sick, really sick. The cold's gotten into his chest, his breathing." She broke off, shaking her head. "It's bad, Ethan." Ranger whined, as if understanding the urgency. Ethan steadied his voice. "Did you call the doctor?" "We tried. Roads are blocked. The storm closed the pass last night. Even if he could start driving right now, he wouldn't make it." Her voice cracked. "He's barely staying warm in their cabin. Walt's burning every piece of wood he's got." Ethan looked toward the ranch, now half hidden in the swirling snow. He pictured the boy, 6 years old, quiet,
always hiding behind his mother's skirt.
He remembered seeing the child cough days earlier, a small sound swallowed by the wind. And now,
"He's fading, Ethan,"
Maya whispered.
"and Walt, he doesn't know what to do."
Ethan felt the weight like a physical blow. Memories clawed at him, faces he couldn't save, cold nights when help never came in time. Ranger nudged his hand firmly, grounding him in the present moment. Ethan swallowed hard. "Tell Walt to bring him here." Maya blinked.
"Here? To the cave?"
"This place is warm, consistent, no drafts, no cold floors. His body needs a stable temperature to fight. He won't get that in a cabin." Maya hesitated.
"Walt may not listen. You know how proud he is."
"Then tell him his pride can't breathe for his son," Ethan said quietly. "Bring Caleb here." Maya nodded and hurried down the trail. Ranger stood beside Ethan, watching her disappear through the drifting snow. Ethan looked back at the cave. The walls glowed softly in lamplight. Heat pulsed through the clay. The air was calm, steady, the closest thing nature could offer to a healing room. But would Walt accept help from the man he'd mocked? Hours passed. The storm strengthened. Snow drifted higher against the ridge. Ranger stood guard at the entrance, gaze fixed on the trail even as daylight faded. Ethan paced inside, unable to keep still. Every few minutes he checked the ventilation, the temperature, the walls, the floor, anything to keep his hands moving, anything to drown the rising tension. Then Ranger barked. A desperate bark, sharp, high, urgent.
Ethan rushed to the entrance. Through the blizzard, Walt Rogers appeared, struggling up the trail with a small bundled shape in his arms. Snow clung to his beard and coat. His breath came in harsh gasps. Behind him, his wife fought through the wind, clutching at the hillside to keep from slipping. Caleb. Ethan sprinted toward them, and Ranger bounded ahead, barking encouragement. Walt stumbled, dropping to one knee, shielding the child from the wind. "Give him to me," Ethan said, kneeling. Walt hesitated only a moment before handing Caleb over. The boy felt too light, too limp. His tiny face was pale, lips tinged a worrying shade. Ethan pressed the back of his hand gently to Caleb's cheek. Cold. Far too cold.
"Inside," Ethan ordered, voice suddenly steady and commanding in a way he hadn't sounded since his military days. "Both of you, now." He carried the boy into the cave, Ranger guiding Walt and his wife through the snow. Once inside, the warmth wrapped around them immediately. Caleb whimpered weakly at the temperature shift. Ethan laid him on his cot near the warmest wall, stripping away wet layers and replacing them with blankets from his pack. Ranger pressed close, sharing his body heat, careful not to disturb the child. Walt and his wife stood nearby, faces anguished, eyes locked on their son. Ethan knelt, speaking gently. "He's fighting. That's a good sign." Walt swallowed hard.
"Cole, I didn't."
His voice cracked. "I didn't think your cave was anything more than a hole in the mountain." Ethan didn't look up. He tucked another blanket around Caleb and checked the boy's breathing. "Doesn't matter what you thought," he said softly. "He's here now." Ranger lowered himself beside the cot, placing a paw gently against Caleb's side, offering warmth like only a loyal dog could. The boy exhaled, a thin, trembling breath. But it was warmer than the one before. Walt's wife covered her mouth, trying not to cry. Walt placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, rough, trembling, grateful. "Please," Walt whispered. "Help him." Ethan nodded once. "I will." The storm raged outside, unrelenting. But inside the cave, For the first time since winter began, a fragile hope flickered in the warm, steady air. Caleb lay curled beneath Ethan's blankets, his breath shallow but no longer icy. The pale glow of the lantern softened the clay walls, making the cave feel like a shelter carved from calm itself. Ranger refused to leave the boy's side. The dog pressed close, lending his warmth, occasionally nudging the child gently whenever his breathing hitched. Ethan moved with disciplined focus, checking the boy's temperature, the airflow, the blankets, the ventilation shafts, anything that could tilt the balance toward life. He could hear Walt and his wife behind him, whispering prayers through choked voices, their hands clasped so tightly the knuckles turned white. But outside, the storm gathered its strength again. Wind slammed against the ridge with a deep, rolling growl, shaking loose snow from the upper ledges. The cold shoved its way across the valley like a predator that refused to retreat. Even inside the cave, Ethan felt small tremors ripple through the stone. Walt's wife flinched. "Is it safe in here?" Ethan nodded. "The mountain won't fail you." He didn't add, "It hasn't failed me yet." Some truths were too heavy for the room. Another hour passed. Caleb stirred faintly but didn't wake. His breathing sounded wet, labored. Maya had warned Ethan the illness had been building for days. The cold floors of the Rogers cabin were likely the final push that tipped the boy into danger. As Ethan placed a warm compress on Caleb's chest, Ranger looked up with a soft whine. The dog's ears twitched sharply. Not at the storm, but at something else. Footsteps. Rapid, uneven, struggling through snow. Ethan moved to the cave entrance, Ranger close behind, body tense. Through the chaotic swirl of wind and flakes, a figure approached, stumbling, covered in snow, breath ragged. It was Walt. But Walt had already been inside the cave, which meant Ethan felt cold wash over him. Caleb had taken a turn. Walt reached the mouth of the cave and braced himself against the rock, gasping. "Cole, he's worse. His voice cracked. "He's barely breathing." Ethan didn't hesitate. "Bring him deeper inside, quick." Walt and his wife rushed to the cot. Caleb's small body shook with each breath, his skin clammy, his face flushed with fever. Ranger whined urgently and placed himself right against the boy again, warming him with instinctive precision. Ethan's pulse quickened, but his voice stayed even. "I need you both to stay calm," he said. "Panic takes air from the room. Caleb needs every bit of it right now." Walt's wife trembled. "He's slipping, Ethan. Please, please." Ethan knelt beside the boy. He lifted Caleb just enough to adjust the blankets and pressed the warm compress closer to his chest. The cave air held steady around them. No drafts, no cold pockets, no shifting temperatures. It was the most stable environment the child could have, but the storm made everything feel more fragile. Outside, the wind shrieked, slamming against the ridge like a tidal wave of frozen air.
Snow curled into the entrance despite Ethan's barriers, dancing across the floor like restless ghosts. The storm wanted in. Ethan looked at Caleb and made a decision. "We're sealing the entrance," he said. Walt blinked. "What?" "If that wind keeps driving through gaps, the temperature will drop. Even a few degrees could make this harder on him." Ethan grabbed slabs of rock and clay-stuffed timber he'd cut earlier, stacking them across the cave opening with methodical speed. Walt joined him, hands shaking but determined. Ranger stayed with Caleb, guarding him with every ounce of his training. When the last slab went in place, the howl of the storm became a muffled roar, still present but distant.
The cave grew dimmer, lit only by 2 lanterns and the faint glow of clay walls reflecting heat. Ethan returned to Caleb's side and placed 2 fingers against the boy's neck. Walt leaned closer, voice breaking. "Is he?" "He's here," Ethan said. "He's fighting." A long silence followed. Ranger nudged Ethan's elbow, then gently licked Caleb's cheek. Slow, careful, comforting. Something about the small gesture made the room soften. Walt's wife let out a trembling sob. Ethan adjusted the blankets once more. "His body needs only one thing right now," he said quietly. "Warmth he doesn't have to produce alone." Walt swallowed hard. "And your cave? It's giving him that?" Ethan nodded. Walt lowered himself to the clay floor, head in his hands. "Cole, I judged you, mocked you, told the whole town you'd gone mad." His voice cracked under the weight of regret. "And here you are, saving my boy." Ethan didn't respond at first. His attention stayed on Caleb, on the way the boy's breathing eased just a fraction as the cave's warmth settled around him. Finally, Ethan said softly, "You're not the first to misunderstand me." Walt looked up, eyes glistening in the lantern light. "But I might be the first you're willing to forgive." Ethan met his gaze. "Right now, the only thing that matters is Caleb." Hours passed. The storm raged. The cave held. And then, Caleb's breathing shifted, smoother, deeper, more controlled. The fever still burned, but it no longer stole his breath. His small hand twitched beneath the blankets, brushing against Ranger's fur.
Walt's wife gasped. He moved. Ethan. He moved. Ethan checked the boy again and allowed the faintest smile. He's stabilizing. Walt let out a sound, half sob, half prayer. He collapsed back against the wall, trembling in relief. But Ethan knew the night wasn't over. Winters in Montana had a way of testing resolve until dawn. He placed one more blanket over Caleb and whispered, "You keep fighting, kid." Outside, the storm screamed against the mountain, furious and wild. Inside the cave, the warmth grew stronger, steadier, like a heartbeat pushing back against the cold. Hope, once fragile, held its ground. Dawn arrived slowly over Redcrest Ridge, cutting through the last remnants of the storm. Sunlight slipped through the narrow gaps Ethan had left uncovered, painting thin lines of gold across the clay walls. The snow outside glowed with a quiet brilliance, but inside, the cave held its soft, unwavering warmth. Caleb slept. For the first time since being carried into the cave, his breathing had found a calmer rhythm. His cheeks, once drained and gray, now carried a faint flush of returning life. His small hand rested on Ranger's neck, fingers curled gently in the dog's fur. Ranger hadn't moved an inch all night. Ethan sat nearby, back against the wall, exhaustion pulling at his bones. But he didn't close his eyes. Every few minutes he checked Caleb's pulse, adjusted blankets, or simply listened to the deep, steady airflow moving through the cave system he had carved.
The mountain breathed warmth upward. The boy breathed it in, and slowly, quietly, fought his way back. Walt and his wife had drifted into an uneasy rest against the far wall, heads touching, arms wrapped around each other for comfort more than warmth. The cave protected them more reliably than any cabin, and though neither spoke it out loud, both knew the truth. Ethan's crazy idea had saved their son. As the sun climbed higher, Ranger lifted his head. His ears perked. A soft sound came from the cot, a tiny, fragile hum. Caleb. The boy blinked at the lantern light, eyes glassy but awake. Ranger let out a quiet, joyful whine and licked the child's cheek. Caleb managed a weak smile.
Mama?
he whispered. Walt's wife hurried to the cot, tears spilling instantly.
I'm here, sweetheart.
I'm right here. She pressed her forehead to his, sobs shaking her shoulders. Walt came next, falling to his knees beside her, brushing a trembling hand over Caleb's hair.
You scared the life out of us,
Walt choked, his voice rough as gravel.
but you're here. You're okay.
Caleb's eyes drifted from his parents to Ranger. He lifted a hand and placed it gently over the dog's paw.
Warm,
the boy whispered. Walt looked up at Ethan with disbelief and gratitude fighting for space in his expression.
Cole, this cave, this dog, all of it kept him alive.
Ethan shook his head. He fought. Ranger just helped him hold the line. Walt rose slowly, walked to the curved wall of the cave, and placed his palm against the clay.
He stayed there for a long moment, absorbing the steady warmth radiating through the stone. It wasn't the forced heat of a stove or the fleeting glow of a fire. It was deeper, ancient, patient, constant. How? Walt asked quietly, voice filled with awe. This wall. Ethan, it's warm. He turned back to stare at Ethan. There's no fire, no chimney. How in God's name? Ethan approached the wall and tapped the clay surface. The earth keeps a steady temperature down deep, around mid-50s, no matter what's happening outside. When you carve into the mountain, you tap into that stability. Walt swallowed, sliding his hand down the wall as if trying to comprehend the mountain itself. And that's what kept Caleb warm, while my own cabin froze through. Ethan nodded.
Traditional cabins fight the weather. This works with it. Walt stared at the cave walls again, his face softening with a profound understanding that settled deeper than the warmth itself. I spent half my life chopping wood till my hands cracked. I thought that's just how winter had to be. But you carved a room out of stone and beat the cold without burning a single log. Ranger padded over and sat beside Ethan, tail gently wagging. Walt looked down at the dog, then back at Ethan. And we laughed at you, he whispered, mocked you, called you broken. He blinked hard. I'm the one who was wrong. Ethan felt the words land heavier than he expected. Not because he needed an apology, but because he had lived so long without hearing understanding from anyone.
The silence stretched in the warm air, thick with realization. Walt's wife turned from the cot, wiping tears from her cheeks. This place saved our boy, she said softly. It saved all of us. Ethan exhaled slowly. The cave felt different now, no longer just a construction project or a shield against storms. It had become proof. Proof that his instincts were right. Proof that his past had taught him something valuable. Proof that even a broken man could build salvation from stone. Walt stepped closer. Ethan, if you're willing, I'd like to learn. Teach me how to build one of these. For my family. For a long moment, Ethan didn't move. Then he nodded. After Caleb's strong enough, he said, I'll show you everything. Walt placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder.
Thank you. Ranger nuzzled Ethan's hand, sensing the shift in the room. Respect replacing ridicule. Trust replacing doubt. Outside, the storm clouds finally broke apart, sunlight spreading across the valley like the first true warmth of the season. Inside the cave, the revelation settled quietly into the hearts of everyone present. This mountain wasn't a curse. This cave wasn't a grave. It was a beginning. One built from earth. One built from survival. One built from a veteran and the dog who never left his side. Word spread faster than any winter wind. By the next morning, the story of Caleb's recovery had threaded through Cedar Hollow like a lifeline. Folks who once whispered about Ethan Cole now spoke his name with something closer to awe and something deeper than admiration. Hope. The kind that comes only when people realize the world might not be as unforgiving as they believed. Snow still blanketed the land, but the storm had eased. A soft brightness filled the valley as sunlight glinted off frosted rooftops. From high on Redcrest Ridge, Ethan stood just outside the cave entrance, breathing in the crisp air. Ranger sat beside him, watching the trail with sharp eyes. Inside the cave, Caleb slept peacefully. Maya had stopped by just before sunrise, checked the boy's lungs, and confirmed what Ethan already saw. The child was on the mend.
He'll need rest, Maya had said, but he's out of danger. You saved him, Ethan.
Ethan didn't answer. He just scratched Ranger's neck. The dog had been the one keeping warmth steady against Caleb all night. If any creature deserved the praise, it was Ranger. But Maya had smiled knowingly.
You two saved him, she said.
Now, as the sun rose higher, Ranger barked once, alerting Ethan before footsteps crunched through the snow. A gathering moved slowly up the trail. 5 families this time. Men wearing thick coats, mothers bundled in scarves, children wrapped like little wool balloons. They climbed carefully, guided by instinct more than invitation. Ethan stiffened, not out of fear, but habit. Ranger moved slightly ahead, ready to assess intentions. Walt Rogers led the group, Caleb's mother beside him. Walt lifted a hand in greeting. His cheeks were red from cold, but his eyes carried a humility that hadn't existed days ago. "Cole!" Walt called, his breath puffing white.
Shakyo, I hope you don't mind visitors. Ethan stepped aside. As long as they don't mind the snow. A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the crowd. Not mocking, not dismissive, just human. Ranger sniffed a few approaching boots, accepting them one by one, tail offering a cautious wag. Walt gestured toward the cave. May we? Ethan nodded. They entered slowly, reverently, as though stepping into a chapel carved by nature rather than hands. Gasps filled the warm air when the clay walls came into view. One of the ranch wives pressed a hand to the smooth surface. It feels alive, like the earth's breathing warmth. Mrs. Hanley from earlier visits whispered, My house froze bowls of water in the kitchen last night, and here you are, in a room warmer than my own bedroom. A teenage boy knelt and held his palms above the clay floor. This is nuts. There's no stove in here. Ethan crossed his arms, leaning against the entry slope. No stove needed. Heat rises from deep in the mountain. Clay traps it. A young father stepped forward, desperation flickering across his face. Can you teach us? Before the next storm hits? The room fell quiet. Ethan didn't speak right away. He looked down at Ranger, who watched the families with calm understanding. The dog seemed to know the moment had shifted from the personal to the community, an unspoken responsibility settling over both him and Ethan. Ranger barked once as if giving permission. Ethan straightened. I can teach you everything I know.
But it won't be easy. Building into stone requires patience, accuracy, respect for the land. Walt nodded vigorously. We understand. We're ready. A ranch wife stepped forward.
Cole, we don't want charity, just guidance.
Ethan's voice softened. This isn't charity. It's survival. He moved toward the cave wall and pressed his hand flat against it, letting the warmth seep into his skin. This mountain doesn't belong to me. Its warmth doesn't either. If it can help you, then it should. The families exchanged hopeful glances, some already wiping tears, others clutching their children closer as if the future had just become less cruel. Walt cleared his throat. "Tell us where to start." So Ethan did.
He led the group outside, showing them the angle of the ridge, how the sun hit the stone, how a shallow cave could be strengthened with domed ceilings and clay layers. He walked them through airflow mechanics, cold intake, warm exhaust, and how thermal mass absorbed heat slowly and released it gradually through the night. Walt listened like a man learning scripture. Others took notes with numb fingers, nodding at every detail. Ranger trotted around proudly, occasionally nudging someone's boot like a supervising foreman, ensuring the humans paid attention. When Ethan finished the demonstration, the ranch father from earlier stepped forward. "Cole, why didn't you tell the town sooner?" Ethan looked at the snow-covered mountains, the endless stretch of pine below. Most folks weren't interested in listening. Walt lowered his gaze, shame pooling in his expression. "We weren't just uninterested. We were cruel. To you. To him." He nodded toward Ranger. "And still, you didn't turn us away." Ethan shrugged gently. "People fear what they don't understand." Mrs. Hanley wiped her eyes. "Well, now we understand." As the families began discussing where to build their own earth-sheltered rooms, Ranger sat beside Ethan, leaning gently against his leg. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's back, grateful for the steady presence. Soon, the ridge echoed with new sounds. Shovels cutting snow, men marking land, women sketching layouts on the ground with sticks. Children played in the snow near Ranger, who tolerated their giggles with patient dignity.
For the first time since the storms began, Redcrest Ridge felt alive again. Not threatened, not frightened, not frozen. Alive. Ethan watched as the community worked together for the first time in a long time. He felt an unfamiliar warmth growing in his chest, deeper than the heat from the mountain. Maybe this cave wasn't just shelter. Maybe it was a bridge. A way back to people. A way back to life. Ranger nudged his elbow again, as if to say, "You see? I told you." Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah," he whispered. "We're getting there." And for the first time, Cedar Hollow wasn't just surviving winter. It was learning how to beat it. As the season stretched on, the valley transformed in ways none of its residents had expected.
Snow still blanketed the land, storms still rolled through, and northern winds still whipped across the pines. But fear no longer ruled Cedar Hollow. At the foot of Redcrest Ridge, small groups of families worked together each morning, carving into hillsides, shaping clay with numb fingers, and building something that felt both ancient and entirely new. Ethan watched them from the upper slope with Ranger sitting proudly beside him. Hammering, laughter, and muffled chatter drifted up the ridge. Sometimes children broke away from their parents and came running to Ranger, throwing arms around the dog's neck or offering sticks he politely refused. Ranger accepted every hug, every pat, every bit of warmth the town finally shared with him. Ethan hadn't expected any of this. He hadn't expected company, or purpose, or the quiet pull of belonging. Yet here it was, growing all around him like spring beneath the snow. By week's end, Walt Rogers had nearly finished his own earth-sheltered room. Ethan supervised the placement of the vents, correcting angles with gentle taps of his chisel, while Walt listened with the same intensity he once reserved only for livestock and storms. "This vent pulls cold air down," Ethan explained. "Let the mountain warm it. The upper vent lets the warm air escape just enough to keep circulation steady." Walt nodded. "Never thought I'd be learning science from a man I once called crazy." Ethan smirked slightly. "Never thought I'd be teaching it." Ranger barked once as if adding, "And you're both welcome."
Meanwhile, Caleb, bundled in a thick scarf, watched from the entrance of their nearly finished shelter. His cheeks were rosy again, his breaths strong. Every time Ranger trotted his way, the boy grinned and waved. Ethan's chest warmed at the sight. He never said it aloud, but seeing the child well again was something he carried like a private victory, a wound stitched closed. Other families followed Walt's lead. The Millers built a smaller chamber near an outcrop of granite, sealing their walls with clay. Mrs. Hanley carved windows from old barn glass. Parsons dug a second room farther up the ridge, muttering proudly about keeping next year's woodpile at 0. And Ethan, quietly, almost without noticing, had become the center of it all.
One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and washed the valley in soft orange light, the community gathered near the base of Ethan's cave. Snow crunched under boots, and lantern flames flickered in the gathering dusk. Ethan stepped out to meet them, Ranger shadowing him. Walt approached first, clearing his throat. "Ethan," he began, we wanted to say something, as a town." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Words directed at him rarely went well, but Walt smiled gently. "You don't have to say anything back. Just listen." Mrs. Hanley stepped beside him. "You saved my friend's grandchild, Ethan," the Miller patriarch added, "and you saved half our livestock."
If we hadn't learned to build our shelters quick, the storm last week would have taken most of them. Maya came forward then. "You brought knowledge here that no book, no teacher, no winter manual ever taught us." Walt nodded. "You gave us warmth when winter gave us none." And then, lifting a wooden plaque he had carved himself, Walt walked to the entrance of Ethan's cave and held it out. It read, "The Coal Shelter. The warmth he gave us." Ethan froze. Ranger nudged his leg gently. A thick stillness fell over the ridge. Boots stopped crunching. Breath lingered in the air. The people of Cedar Hollow simply stood there, waiting, offering something Ethan hadn't felt from a crowd in years. Not pity, not fear, not suspicion. Respect. Ethan swallowed, unable to find words at first.
His throat tightened, his breath catching between the cold and something deeper. He looked at Ranger, who sat tall, ears perked, proud but peaceful. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head, grounding himself. Then he lifted his eyes to the townspeople. "I didn't do this alone," he said quietly. "Ranger kept me going when I couldn't. This shelter, this warmth, it belongs to both of us, and to all of you now." A breeze drifted across the ridge, carrying only calm this time. Children laughed softly behind their parents, tossing snow at Ranger, who joined in with playful jumps that made Caleb giggle uncontrollably. The sun slipped lower, turning the snowfields into rivers of gold and pink.
Ethan stepped aside as Walt mounted the plaque beside the cave entrance, hammering it firmly into the stone. Each strike echoed like a promise. The coal shelter, born of stone, saved a boy, changed a town. As evening settled, families began heading down the trail, lanterns bobbing like warm fireflies in the twilight. Maya lingered a moment longer. "You know," she said softly, "you didn't just build a shelter, Ethan. You built a place where people feel safe." Ethan looked at the glowing cave entrance. "Funny," he murmured. "I thought I built it because I didn't feel safe anywhere." Maya smiled. "Maybe that's why it works." She headed down the trail, leaving Ethan alone with Ranger as the first stars blinked awake above the ridge. Ethan sat on a smooth stone outside the cave.
Ranger settled at his feet, resting his chin on Ethan's boot. Snow glittered under the starlight like scattered diamonds. Ethan exhaled slowly, deeply, letting the cold air fill his lungs and empty years of tension. "We found our place, buddy." Ranger looked up with soft eyes, tail thumping once in quiet agreement. The cave behind them radiated steady warmth. The mountain hummed like an old friend, and for the first time since returning home, Ethan felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Peace. Not the kind that comes from silence or hiding or digging away from the world, but the kind that comes from choosing to live again. Together, man and dog watched the valley breathe under the winter sky, their shelter glowing warm against the cold. And the world, for once, felt gentle.
If you made it to the end of this story, I'd love to hear from you. Just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments to let me know you're here and still enjoying these journeys with our veteran and his loyal dog. Your comments help this channel grow, and they tell me you want more stories like this. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are many more powerful, heartwarming adventures coming your way. Stay with us. Ethan, Ranger, and the next chapter are just around the corner.